Good evening, and welcome to the Period Gallery. My name is Jeff Schaefer. I direct the Hale Institute here at the college. It is a real privilege that we have with us here in town Dr. Paul Miller from Georgetown University to address the important and ever-relevant subject of just war theory. He has written a book on that subject, Just War and Ordered Liberty, and I'm told that in the next few months he has another one coming out on the ethics of war. So he has a fascinating professional resume with a lot of high level of experience that's relevant to this field of consideration. Some quick bio highlights for him. Dr. Miller is a professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University. He is a senior non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council and a research fellow with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. He served as director for Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council staff in the White House for Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He previously served in the Central Intelligence Agency and is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan with the U.S. Army. Before inviting him to the lectern, I thought I'd read also from the dedication page of his book. Found this interesting. He said, "This book is dedicated to my grandfather, Harold Miller, and my father, David H. Miller, coming from the Mennonite tradition. Both were pacifists and conscientious objectors during World War II and the Vietnam War, respectively. My father challenged me to justify my decision to serve in the United States Army. Though this book is not a direct response to pacifism, it is, with love, the fruit of a lifetime of reflection on justice and war inspired by our debates." Would you please welcome Dr. Miller?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the Hale Institute. Thank you to the Period Gallery for hosting this event. And thank you for your time. I never take for granted that people would willingly spend their free time listening to me talk. So I appreciate it, and I hope to give you some gift of an insight in return. When is war just, and what does justice require? When is war just, and what does justice require? These are the two questions that animated this book and animated actually quite a bit of my life. You heard something of my biography. I served in the United States Army and did a tour in Afghanistan and spent 10 years of my career working on the war in various capacities. And of course, the questions were personal as well because of my family background. When is war just, and what does justice require? I began to read deeply into the just war tradition, seeking answers to these questions. What I found was surprising to me. I found a multiplicity of just war traditions, plural. And I found no single answer to the questions, when is war just and what does justice require? Indeed, asking when is war just, I found quite a variety of answers in the just war texts, such as from Augustine and Aquinas and Suarez, Gentili and Pufendorf and others. They said that war is just to defend the true faith, to enforce the right of free passage, to enforce the right of proselytization, to defend against invasion, to recover stolen property, to exact recompense for damages, to deter future wrongdoing, to vindicate honor, to preserve the balance of power, to defend the innocent, to defend one's rights, to defend human rights generally, to punish the wicked, to punish crimes against nature, to stop genocide, and more. So there is no seeming consensus on this question. When is war just, and what does justice require? So many answers. You may know that the conventional just war framework, anybody here ever heard of just war, taken a class in just war? Just quick, okay, so some familiarity. You probably are familiar with the categories with Latin names. Traditionally, just war discourse is divided into three big categories: the justice of war, jus ad bellum; the justice in war, jus in bello; and the justice after war, jus post bellum. Justice of war, in war, after war. It roughly maps to the chronology as we get into a war, fight a war, and get out of a war. Those are helpful categories for structuring debate. They're further broken down into subcategories. And I think that they are useful, but they are not a formula. They don't spit out an answer. It's not a mathematical formula where you plug in your war and it spits out an answer, just or unjust. It can be frustrating even to watch public debate and watch people use the categories to arrive at their predetermined conclusion. Just a couple of days ago, pagers and cell phones and walkie-talkies began exploding across southern Lebanon in what apparently is an attack by the state of Israel against Hezbollah. And immediately I began seeing and hearing and reading articles, conversations by people saying, oh, this was a just attack against an enemy, or an unjust, indiscriminate attack that was not targetable and in a dense civilian population. So again, the just war categories don't spit out an answer. What I found as I dug into this is that there are three just war traditions, each with their own worldview, with their own way of looking at the world, and that these different just war traditions generate different answers to the questions of when war is just and what justice requires. Three just war traditions. I call them the Augustinian tradition, Augustine, the Westphalian tradition, and finally the liberal tradition. The Augustinian, the Westphalian, and the liberal traditions of just war thinking. All of them share in common a belief that war can be justified, so they are in distinction to pacifism, and they are in distinction to realism, in the belief that justifying war requires a moral language and it requires meeting strict criteria. The secular tradition of realism holds that war essentially needs no justification other than political necessity or the needs of the state. The just war traditions are also in contrast to the holy war tradition, which was prevalent in Christendom for 1,000 years, and said that war could be fought to spread the true faith, for the parochial interest of the church. The just war traditions, all of them, hold that war can be justified, but that it needs special justification and it must not be fought for the parochial interests of the church. That is what unifies the just war traditions. Before I dig into the three, the Westphalian, the Augustinian, and the liberal traditions, let me briefly say something about pacifism, because I've found that pacifism is the default position for many young Christians who've never been taught otherwise. Pacifism is the convictional belief that violence is never appropriate under any conditions, even by the state. And I think it stems for many Christians from the King James Version of the Sixth Commandment, which reads, "Thou shalt not kill." Sorry to say, that's a mistranslation of the Sixth Commandment. It did not prohibit killing. It prohibited, in Hebrew, retzach. And the Hebrew word retzach means murder, and it means manslaughter. Thou shalt not murder is a more appropriate translation. In the Gospels, when Jesus and John the Baptist and the Apostle Paul interacted with Roman soldiers and centurions, they never told them to leave the Roman army as a condition for salvation. There's no suggestion, I think, in Scripture that Christians are obligated to be pacifists. I respect the individual conscience of anybody who feels they are unable to participate in military service, but I think it is not an option for Caesar, for the government, to absent itself from the duty to bear the sword against evildoers. So let's talk about the three traditions of just war thinking: the Augustinian, the Westphalian, and the liberal. The Augustinian tradition of just war thinking is maybe more appropriately called the Christendom approach to just war thinking. It is a worldview that grew before Christianity, starting in the works of Cicero and other pagan philosophers, but came to fruition through the work of Augustine and most fully in the work of Thomas Aquinas. And it starts with the belief that there is a natural law. There is a moral code inscribed in the created order of the universe, and that we can access that moral code with training, with proper education. We don't need special revelation. We don't need the scriptures. We need the light of reason to apprehend the natural law. This Augustinian approach believes that the natural law teaches that we human beings are naturally sociable, that we are drawn to fellowship with other human beings, and that we have a purpose, a telos, an end, a fulfillment, a direction in a life of community and a life of piety before God or the gods, is what the pagans would say. Because of this natural law, that presents a certain view of the state, of government, of what government is for. Government exists to uphold a framework of life in which human beings can live out that purpose. Government exists to uphold the foundations of civilization, the basic infrastructure of order and peace and justice, so that humans can live out their calling as humans, can fulfill their telos and reach full human flourishing. That's what it means to do justice. It means to uphold the conditions of society that enable human flourishing. That's an Augustinian understanding of justice and natural law. And that leads to an Augustinian understanding of sovereignty, the purpose of government. Government exists to uphold this framework. If that's true, that tells you what the sword is for. The sword is for defending defending the flourishing society, defending the conditions that yield human flourishing, defending the peace, the order, and the justice that yield flourishing for all. When it's under violent attack, the sword, the ruler must bear the sword to defend all that. If this sounds intuitive, that's good. It means you were taught well in Sunday school. It stands in contrast to what we're going to hear in a moment from the Westphalian and later the liberal traditions. That's what justice looks like. That's what a just war is. It is bearing the sword to uphold the community's peace, order, and justice for the sake of flourishing. In that condition, yes, a war of self-defense is just, but so is a war to defend the innocent. I was very surprised to learn in my research that what we call today humanitarian intervention was widely debated 500 years ago by Augustinian theologians and jurists, and they all supported it. Suarez, Gentili, Grotius, to a lesser extent, Vittoria, addressed the idea of humanitarian intervention and explicitly and repeatedly endorsed it. They believed it was a responsibility of the sovereign, the prince, the king, to wield the sword when they saw unusual oppression or tyranny abroad, when they saw piracy, cannibalism, human sacrifice, or what they called crimes against nature. They understood that most governments in the world are imperfect, and that wasn't a just cause to intervene. But they also recognized there was a line beyond which governments became especially heinous. And under those conditions, it was the responsibility of a true Christian sovereign to do something about that heinous evil and to save victims of piracy, cannibalism, or human sacrifice. This is a distinctive feature of the Augustinian just war framework, a belief that the sovereigns had a responsibility to bear the sword, to defend the innocent, and punish the wicked. This was just war in Christendom for 1,000 years. Christendom came crashing down with the wars of religion of the 16th and 17th centuries, as Protestants and Catholics spent a century and a half killing each other. And as the concept of Christendom came crashing down, so did the theology and the philosophy upholding the Augustinian just war. Whole notions of natural law, justice, and sovereignty began to fade away or be deliberately torn down in an effort to build a new world on the ashes of Christendom. And this is what I'm calling the Westphalian world, after the treaties of Westphalia, 1648, that ended the wars of religion. The Westphalian perspective, and I might as well call it the Hobbesian perspective, this is Thomas Hobbes. Several things change. Moving away from the Augustinian tradition, let me mention three quickly. Number one, it was a tradition of legal reasoning more than political theology. It was developed by secular philosophers like Hobbes, Samuel Pufendorf, Christian von Wolff, and lawyers like Aimé de Vattel, Swiss jurist. They appealed, all of them, to Hobbes, not to Augustine. Second, they changed the concept of natural law. No longer was there a notion that we were naturally inclined to sociability, nor that we had a natural end or purpose towards which we were oriented. Rather, natural law no longer had a telos governing it. Natural law, in their view, taught that we live in a state of nature, that we have a right to defend ourselves and contract with others for mutual defense. Nature, in their view, nature is red in tooth and claw. Natural law was nothing more than the law of the jungle. Hobbes argued the first principle of natural law was the right to survival, the right of self-defense. This is very different from a Ciceronian or Augustinian natural law. If you apply this idea of natural law to relations among nations and states, you get to a very different international situation, one profoundly marked by mutual suspicion and fear rather than a community of nations unified by common values. That had been possible under an Augustinian system. The third major difference is that the Westphalian system focuses on procedural justice rather than substantive justice, process not ends. What matters was the vindication of rights rather than what people did with those rights. Put these differences together, and you begin to see a profoundly different understanding of what war is for. War is not to defend abstract notions of peace, justice, and order, and war is certainly not for defending the innocent or punishing the wicked. War is for defending international boundaries, and that's it. War is a tool for legitimate self-defense, and the self being defended wasn't the abstract concept of justice, nor was it the people. It was the state, newly personified as a corporate entity. And to defend the self meant to defend the borders around the self. International borders become sacrosanct. There is no grounds to intervene abroad for any reason, regardless of what one sovereign is doing to his people or others. Just war, the just cause for war, shrinks in a sense. It narrows. It thins up. Just war, on an Augustinian conception, is a fairly broad concept. It can be employed a lot, but it is also a concept that implies a lot of responsibility for what that war should accomplish. If you're truly fighting with love for your enemy and for the innocent whom you're defending, even love for the wicked whom you're punishing, it implies a responsibility to build in the aftermath. Not on the Westphalian conception. On the Westphalian conception, you go to war for your state, to take territory, to win glory, to win honor as a prince, and in the aftermath of the war, you go home and enjoy the spoils. There's no sense of responsibility to invest in lasting justice and peace. Over time, this becomes an excuse for sovereigns to assert the right to do whatever they want within their borders. It parallels the rise of absolutism and authoritarianism at home, and it becomes problematic with mass atrocities, war crimes, genocide, human rights violations that we're sadly all too familiar with. It also yields an era of what is called the sovereigns' wars, almost unending warfare in Europe in the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries, fought for no other reason than the prince's glory, honor, or territorial conquest. That's the history of Europe for two and a half centuries. This era comes to an end in 1945. With the end of World War II, there's a widespread recognition of the need to revise again sovereignty, law, and justice for a new era, to put limits on what sovereigns are allowed to do even within their own borders. And that means to revise the concept of sovereignty, to throw out hard Westphalian sovereignty, under which sovereigns could hide behind their borders and do whatever they wanted to their own people, and to make room for some kind of international accountability for the worst crimes. This comes about first through the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, through which the Nazis and the senior leaders of Imperial Japan were held accountable for war crimes. It was then codified in the Genocide Convention a few years later. It's the first time in history that an act of state could be considered illegal under international law, and individual government leaders were held criminally liable for acts of state. Just can't stress what a revolution that is in sovereignty, justice, and natural law that came about through these innovations. What it amounts to is a new liberal tradition of just war thinking, a liberal tradition of just war thinking. I call it liberal because it draws from the intellectual resources of classical liberalism, resting on the dignity and the rights of the individual. War is now an instrument to defend not the state, not only the state as a corporate entity, but also individual human lives. And that means war must vindicate and restore the rights of individuals. That was the whole purpose of the Nuremberg and Tokyo and the Genocide Convention, is to say, look, we value individual humans. We are going to say as an international principle that human beings have dignity, have equal liberty, and a right to life. And so our wars from here on out, under the liberal tradition, will be fought to vindicate and restore individual rights as much as national rights. And this is where we get the contemporary era of humanitarian interventions, post-Cold War, as we find ways to intervene, to stop war crimes, genocide, and atrocities in the Balkans in the 1990s, did not intervene in Rwanda, did intervene, the United Kingdom intervened in Sierra Leone, and a long, protracted debate about whether or not to intervene in Syria. Ultimately, we did not. You may note a similarity between the Augustinian and the liberal traditions, in that they both recognize an authority above and outside the state, a moral standard. The Augustinians call it natural law, or God, or nature, or scripture. The liberals call it human rights. But what are human rights but another form of natural law reasoning? When you say that there's a self-evident right, you're saying it's grounded in nature. So both these traditions are finding a way to hold sovereigns accountable. In their view, sovereignty is ultimate responsibility. In the Westphalians' view, sovereignty is ultimate power. And you see how that can lead to profoundly different understandings of what government is for and what the government may use the sword for. For the Augustinians and the liberals, the prince, the government, is accountable for using the sword for specified purposes, for justice, for peace, for order, to defend the innocent, to uphold human rights. That's why I want to call for a Augustinian liberalism, or perhaps a liberal Augustinianism, a marriage, if you will, between the first and the third just war traditions. I think, as both a Christian and as an American, I want to see our government wield the sword justly, and what that means is to, yes, uphold principles of justice, peace, and order for us and for our enemies, and it means to do so with an eye towards the individual dignity of our citizens and theirs. I think that is the only defensible way to win and wage a war. This obviously covers cases of defense against invasion. Ukraine is fighting a just war of self-defense against Russia, and they are justified in seeking allies, and we're permitted to come to their aid. I do think it's prudent not to send ground troops there. I think Israel is fighting a just war of defense, not just against Hamas and Hezbollah today, but against a century-long campaign to delegitimize the state. I would have some critique for how Israel's been waging that war. I'd like to see them wage it with a bit more discrimination, a bit more proportionality. But I think the biggest takeaway is that when we wage a war, we must wage it with love for our citizens, for our enemies. And that means fighting with an eye towards the peace and the justice we want to see come out of the war. In practical terms, this means far more attention to post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization. I think this is exactly what we did wrong in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that we fought those wars effectively. We killed a lot of people because our armies are good at that. And we did not invest in lasting peace and justice in either case. And I believe that that is the root of the failures that we saw in both of those countries. Imagine a world in which, in Afghanistan, we had quickly overthrown the Taliban, as we did in 2001, and then on that day, we announced, we're going to stay for 20 years rebuilding your country. If we had made that decision from day one, how different the war would have been. If we had been patient in dispersing aid, if we had rebuilt an army and a police force, again, patiently, slowly from the ground up, instead of what we did, which was no nation building at all for 5 years, and then a panicked, rushed, incompetent campaign for a couple of years, and then we gave up and spent 10 more years just killing terrorists. I think a conscious, deliberate, sober effort at post-conflict reconstruction could have changed the trajectories of those wars in ways that would be both strategically effective and morally defensible. And in the event, we did, sadly, neither. Let me conclude by reflecting on what this approach in Augustinian liberalism could mean for the world today. I think that what we sometimes call the liberal international order, I hate that phrase. I'd just rather call it the free world. I think that the free world rests on what I understand to be a theology of secularized Christendom. In other words, Christendom was an idea that we will have a community of nations bound together on the basis of shared Christian values. What we're calling the free world or the liberal international order is actually a new effort to build a community of nations on the basis of universal enlightenment values of equality and dignity for all. That is the free world or the liberal international order. And I think it is just and good. It's imperfect, we should make it better, but the idea in principle is consistent with a natural law appreciation for justice and the purpose of government. If our individual governments should defend peace, justice, and order and individual dignity, then doing that in concert with other like-minded nations around the world who also happen to believe the same things that we do can only be just. Sustaining and upholding that community of nations devoted to that vision is a high calling for statecraft, and I think it would be a just use of the sword to uphold such a vision. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to consider your questions.
I am interested in approaching this from, or at least I guess most exposure because of what the Supreme Court does in response to certain things. Your tenure in the White House was during kind of the war on terror years. I wonder if you have some thoughts about how the court answered certain questions, for instance, in Rondon and Boumediene versus Bush, those kinds of questions. Do you think the court handled it well or not well? Maybe you could elaborate on what it did.
I could have given you a much better answer about 10 years ago when I was following this stuff very closely. I think that the Bush administration did not do itself favors by trying to by deliberately carving out a place of legal ambiguity in Guantanamo Bay. That I would like to have seen them either call them combatants and apply the international law of war, or not, or host them in a facility in theater. What they did on purpose was to create a place where the law could not reach. That was a mistake. I think it was a mistake both strategically and probably morally as well. And so the court was forced to offer correction after correction after correction. I think the compromise we eventually reached was probably not the best. I think the Bush administration could have, from the outset, designed something more defensible. But what we got is kind of a second best outcome where the court is almost micromanaging what we're allowed to do there in Guantanamo. It's a shambolic structure, if you will. Look, during World War II, we captured half dozen or so Nazi saboteurs, and we put them on a military commission and we executed them. We have every legal right to do that. So if we had just done that, I think that'd be okay, but that's not quite what the Bush administration did. So that was unfortunate. Did that answer your question? Yes. Yeah. A lawyer could probably give a much better answer than that. Yeah.
Two things. One's a follow-up on him. Ask me later, I know about the history of internment of German immigrants, the legal issues of that compared to what happened to Japanese Americans. That's part and parcel of the story you're asking. But my question is to you, what is the just war theory of Islam, or main theories of Islam, and how are they likely to conflict with us in the future?
There's a great book on this by James Turner Johnson, who he compared directly the just war tradition and sort of theories of war in the Islamic tradition. So go look that book up if you want the fullest answer. My understanding is that there's a couple of different ways of thinking about war in the Islamic tradition. One is very similar to the just war tradition. There are other versions. So the one that would be controversial is the notion of jihad, which if you ask an Islamic theologian, they'll tell you that jihad means struggle. And most of the hadiths and the Quranic passages about jihad are about the inner struggle of the heart for purity and holiness. But there is a minority of scholars, there's a minority of jihadists who say, no, we have to wage jihad, an outward jihad against the enemies of Islam. So that tradition is there. It is not the majority tradition within Islam. There is also another distinction they'll draw between the Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb, that is the abode of Islam versus the abode of war. The abode of Islam is where Islam is predominant, so the Islamic world or the nations of the OIC. And within the abode of Islam, you don't kill fellow Muslims, right? But within the rest of the world, there's a different standard at play. That would be another concept they use in thinking about war. Right there.
How would, given some of the tenets of Augustinian just war theory, how would you deal with, in Augustinian liberal just war theory, certain unusual methods of warfare, such as unconventional or guerrilla warfare?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think irregular warfare, first of all, is not as new as we think it is, and is maybe not as unconventional. It's almost the normal mode of warfare, honestly. Principles still apply. Still got to fight for love for our enemies. Still got to fight for a just cause. It does make discrimination or proportionality harder, because when the enemy hides or does not wear uniforms or deliberately hides within a civilian population, it makes it real hard. I think that we are still obligated to try. I don't think that we ever use war as an excuse for murder. And we never use war as an excuse to loosen the stand. We don't use the enemy's moral failures as an excuse to loosen our standards and how we target. So we still have to strive to discriminate between soldier and civilian, or combatant and non-combatant. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we did the same thing as we did in Vietnam, which was we went in fighting a conventional war against an unconventional opponent, which is strategically stupid and also morally at fault. And in all three cases, we then gradually adopted a counterinsurgency strategy, which I would say is the effort to err on the side of more restraint and more love for our enemies. I think counterinsurgency, whatever you think of its merits, practically, I think it was more effective, is more morally defensible because it is the effort to fight with more targeted precision. And by the way, the point of counterinsurgency isn't to kill the bad guy; it's to protect the friendly population. And to invest in the lasting conditions of peace and justice for the population, and thus starve the enemy of recruits. That's the theory behind counterinsurgency. I think it actually was showing promising signs of success, especially in Iraq, a little bit less in Afghanistan, but I wish we could have stuck with it longer. Yeah, there.
Could you specify a bit more what you mean by Augustinian liberalism? What is it in Augustinianism that needs to be chastened by liberalism, or what does liberalism add to Augustinianism?
So Augustinianism is irretrievable in our cultural moment because we don't live in Christendom. We don't live in Christian Europe. We don't live in a world where we can reimpose a sort of Christianity as the official public morality of our public square. If you want to know why not, come to my lecture tomorrow about Christian nationalism. Can't be done. And I don't think I don't think it should. I would actually critique Christendom as an improper political theology. But there's a lot else we could salvage from a broad Augustinianism. And I think liberalism emerged largely from a lot of Christian thinkers, or at least thinkers steeped in a Christian mindset. I think an appropriate separation between the jurisdictions of church and state is actually a biblical principle. And I think that we Christians should acknowledge that. And I think that the centering of human rights is an organic development of a sort of Augustinian thought. I guess what I'm saying is, if you're going to defend peace, justice, and order as an Augustinian, doing that by protecting a free society and human rights is a good way of doing that. So I think there's a natural confluence there. And it's the easiest way for us in the 21st century to recapture as much of the Augustinianism as we can. Does that make sense? Yeah. In the back? Or in the middle back? Yeah, right there. Yeah.
I mean, one of the standard use development criteria is probability of success. So it doesn't make sense for Liechtenstein to invade North Korea or something, even though things are bad there. But I'm thinking about with Iraq, if we stay 20 years, or Afghanistan, whatever, it's not as though, I think you can do that Marshall Plan there, or you can say MacArthur in and the Emperor's not God, and you clean it up. Is it really possible to stay 20 years and turn Afghanistan into anything approaching Jordan or whatever? Is the Islamic resistance to sensible, decent government so strong that it's a fool's project?
Is it possible to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years? Yeah, we did it.
I mean, yeah, but you know, nation. Yeah.
So you're pushing all my buttons, and where do I even start? Yeah. So where to start there? The standard of success isn't turning Afghanistan into Sweden. The standard is changing its trajectory, which we were basically did accomplish, and then it changed again, right? To change a society's trajectory, to stop mass political violence, to halt a downward spiral in the economy, to put basic institutions back together. That's very achievable. We accomplished it in the Balkans, and Bosnia is a primarily Muslim country, by the way. We were learning lessons on how to do this better throughout the 1990s, and then we basically gave up after Iraq and Afghanistan. So I do believe it's possible to achieve some degree of success in these kinds of post-conflict reconstruction stabilization operations. Between us, NATO, and the United Nations, we achieved some degree of success, not just in the Balkans, but also in much of Central America, and in Mozambique, and in Namibia, and in East Timor, and in Sierra Leone, and in Liberia the second time. So a variety of small examples of some degree of success. Now you asked if there's a degree of resistance within Islamic societies. I want to emphasize that what we're trying to do when we do this is not exporting our culture or even necessarily our values. Much of post-conflict reconstruction involves building roads, schools, and hospitals. And everybody likes those things. It's not uniquely Western. The Afghan women out there loved roads, schools, and hospitals. So there's nothing in their culture or their religion that made them resistant to that. It was not even a Western imposition. Their democratic constitution wasn't. When Afghanistan adopted their constitution in 2004, what they did was copy and paste from their own 1964 democratic constitution, which we did not write. So they themselves had the resources within their history to move towards a democratic system. it is not uniquely Western to not want to be oppressed. People all around the world generally like the opportunities to have a say in their government. I know that there's this narrative out there that fostering democracy is somehow us forcing our way of life on them. I just want to observe that we're living near the high point of human freedom in all of recorded human history. It's kind of a weird time to be skeptical about global democracy. The high point was about 2005. We have seen some backsliding since then. In the 1990s, as democracy was sweeping Eastern Europe and making inroads in East Asia shortly after Tiananmen Square, it was also sweeping much of Africa. And there was a people power movement in the nation of Malawi, which had been under the dictatorship of a guy named President Hastings Banda for quite some time. And Hastings Banda saw that writing on the wall. He saw the wave of democratization, and he said, I better do something about this. I'm going to co-opt it. I'm going to hold a referendum. And on the referendum, there was one question. The question was, do you want me to remain as president for life, or would you like multi-party democracy? And Hastings Banda forgot to rig the election. And the Malawians voted for democracy. And they did it without Western imposition or Western troops or an occupation or anything. Democracy is actually very popular around the world, especially among women and religious and ethnic minorities, because they're the ones who stand to benefit the most. Who opposes democracy around the world? Rich men of the ruling tribe, because they're the ones who benefit from all other forms of government. So democracy is actually very popular among poor people, women, and minorities. And it's not us imposing our system on them. Yeah.
I'd be curious, you said, perhaps the ideal would have been we go in and we say we're going to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years. But I would guess that the immediate pushback to that in a lot of circles nowadays would be, oh, that's imperialism. So is there a practical way to get around that concern so that that's actually viable? Or is this just an ideal that would be nice?
I certainly would not advocate going in and saying we're going to stay for 20 years unless the Afghans welcomed us. Right. So I should say that's a maybe unstated, I should state it, that is a premise of this whole thing. And by the way, they did. They wanted us to stay. When we first went in, there was a whole lot of concern like, oh, we don't want to be there too much because the Afghans might kick us out. Actually, they were asking us to come and spend more money and send more people and stay for longer. They were very keen in those early years about us sticking around. So I think a strong signal of commitment would have reassured the Afghans and helped out the reconstruction efforts early on. So no, I would not advocate unilaterally doing this against the will of the local people. Yeah, that's a very practical thing.
I just wanted to make sure I understood you correctly.
I try that too sometimes. It can be hard. My students wish all the time.
Would you say that a local police force is a microcosm of Augustinian framework?
You mean the authority to use coercion by the police to uphold?
Well, just to defend, everybody's happiness and order.
Yeah. Everything I've said applies to policing as well as to war. It's really a theory of just force or just coercion, using force to uphold order domestically against criminals. It's the same thing theologically. Yeah. So if that's what you're asking, then yeah.
Could you provide us with some insight into what it's like to serve on the National Security Council? I'm curious how easy or difficult it is for you to influence the president's decisions overseas. Do you speak with him directly? Or if somebody here has firm convictions of just war and wants to see our government apply them overseas, do they just need to get on the council and then they can impose their philosophies? Or?
Clearly, I was not terribly successful at this. I worked for two presidents. I was there for the last year of the Bush administration and much of the first year of the Obama administration. I was not a political appointee. My job was primarily to offer support for the National Security Advisor and the president. So that would be General Lute, he was the Deputy National Security Advisor, and Steve Hadley, Jim Jones, and then then Bush and Obama. So yes, I was in meetings and interacted with them. At my level, the job was more about like writing a memo for today's phone call with the prime minister, and here's the issues, and here's the suggested talking points. And sure, I'm using my own analysis and my own convictions to shape that. The president is the president. And also my stuff went through several layers before it got to him. It's not like I could just barge into the Oval and say, "You're doing this wrong, sir." Better example is a guy named Dan Heimbach, who's now a professor at Southeastern Theological Seminary, I think. Dan Heimbach was I hope I get this right, I think he's the Secretary of the Navy under the George H.W. Bush administration. In some capacity, he served in the H.W. Bush administration, and he is credited in the history books with explicitly bringing the just war framework into H.W. Bush's thinking about the Gulf War. There's a particular incident in the closing days of that war when we had won, but the Iraqis had not surrendered yet, and they were fleeing Baghdad down the one highway that left Baghdad, and it was nicknamed the Highway of Death because there was tens of thousands of vehicles and a lot of dead bodies there because the Air Force would just go down the highway and drop the bombs. And when Bush saw that, he said, "Stop." The Iraqis had not surrendered, but Bush told them to stop the bombing because it was wrong, because it was pointless slaughter. That's an example of doing it right. Legally speaking, if the Iraqis had not surrendered, they're fair targets. Morally speaking, there's no point to the senseless slaughter of these fleeing soldiers and civilians. That's a small example of where, yes, sometimes these conversations directly bear on decisions by senior policymakers. I wish it happened more often. Now ask me about President Obama's Nobel lecture.
Yeah, so how would you reconcile just war theory with the historical events recorded in Scripture? There's conflicts where Israel is told to win and wipe out this nation, to the last man, woman, and child, etc.
Holy war, yeah. The difference between Israel and every other nation in the world. God commissioned Israel for one very specific purpose, to be the vehicle for the Messiah and a reflection of his glory. It was both a state with the sword and also a church. It was the only one in history that ever got to be both. Lots of other governments try to be that, and they shouldn't. God has not authorized any other government on the planet in history to be both a state and a church, a reflection of his glory and the particular vehicle for his message. No other state, no other nation in the world has ever had that commissioning. They all bear the sword. They may use the sword for a public purpose, not a parochial purpose of the church or a religious purpose, or they don't have that relationship with God where he directly tells them to go kill these people. So ancient Israel is not a model for our states today. Make sense? Yeah.
What do you think about the issue of the extermination of the Indians in American history?
I think that it was wrong. Full stop. I've looked at that just a little bit. It's interesting that if you look at the statements of presidents, particularly President Washington, President Grant, and a few others, I think they were actually trying to do the right thing. The war, the endless warfare between settlers and Native Americans was often done at the civilian level. And it was less the U.S. government than it was almost spontaneous violence across the frontier. And so you could fault the government for not enforcing its own laws. But by and large, I think that we are morally culpable for a lot of injustice. Yeah. Yes, I'm back.
Do you ever see a place for wars of conquest that are launched as in response to self-defense? So say Azerbaijan has invaded Armenia multiple times, and in response, Armenia says we are going to now conquer Azerbaijan and establish our permanence, expand our state permanently into Azerbaijan in self-defense.
Probably not. But here's the example that comes to mind. World War II was a war of self-defense until October 1944. And you know what happened in October 44? We crossed the border into Germany. And we had liberated all the territory. There was no more Nazi-occupied territory in Europe. And we crossed the border and invaded Germany. Maybe that's what you're getting at. We conquered Germany, and it was no longer about self-defense, except in the sense that they had not surrendered. The evil government was still in power, and they were going to keep on doing it if we left them in power. And so it was a necessary extension of our self-defense to overthrow the Nazi regime. So that's an example. That's pretty in extremis. What you're asking about really is the justice of total war. The justice of total war. Can total war be justified? And the answer is, yeah, but it's really hard, and it should be hard. It should be really hard to justify that. It should only be just if it is necessary, and it almost never is. It was in World War II, but it almost never is necessary to wage total war. And that's basically my answer on Hiroshima as well. Nuclear weapons are almost always unjust, except for when they're not.
Give you another one. We've been talking about just war theory. There's something recently inaugurated in the last couple of decades, just peace theory. Do you have any comments on that?
I like it. I think it is, when I talk about the moral imperative of investing in peace and justice, I think it's kind of the same thing. So I'm talking about it under the category of use post bellum. And I gather that's largely what I think they're talking about as well. Peace, this is all over Franklin Roosevelt's wartime rhetoric, by the way. Peace isn't the natural state of things, and it doesn't happen by accident whenever wars aren't happening. Peace is an accomplishment that must be actively sought and cultivated and built. That's, I think, the point of the just peace literature, and that's also what I would say is true of the aftermath of war. When the shooting stops, that doesn't mean you've reached peace. It means you're in either a stalemate or a ceasefire, and the violence might start back up again unless you start addressing some root causes. I think the best scholarly treatment on this is by Eric Patterson, where he's written about the need for order, justice, conciliation in the aftermath of war. Order, justice, conciliation. You have to physically impose order on a society first, which we didn't do in Iraq. Then you have to start addressing the injustices that were at the root of the war. And then, hopefully, long-term, you can begin to invest in conciliation or healing relationships, which is very hard to do. But again, think about World War II. Reincorporating Germany into the community of West Germany, into the community of nations, eventually into NATO, that is a healing of relationships with the rest of Europe. It's a great example of conciliation. And we're particularly bad at it. Convince me that there's any order, justice, or conciliation at the end of Israel's war on Hamas. They absolutely have every right. They're waging a just war against Hamas. The world would be a better place with no Hamas in it. But the way Israel's going about this war, convince me that they are actually fighting in a way that will yield order, justice, or conciliation. I don't believe they are. I don't think there's any justice or peace at the end of this. There's a lot of killing, and I don't mourn dead Hamas terrorists. But I mourn the fact that we're going to live with perpetual violence and injustice in that part of the world, because I see no end to this. And I think Netanyahu bears a lot of blame by the choices he's made on how to fight this war.
We don't have time to try to convince you, but I think I could. No, I give it a shot.
Can you comment on the Vietnam War? I missed it by this much, fortunately, and I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah. On Vietnam and Hiroshima, I actually deliberately avoided studying them for ages and ages because people get really worked up about it. But since I wrote a book about just war, I have to have an opinion about it. Here's what I think about Vietnam. I think that South Vietnam had a right to defend itself. I think North Vietnam was an aggressor and clearly attacked through subversion and insurgency from 1954 onward. And South Vietnam had every right to seek allies You can quibble about the prudence of our decision to come to South Vietnam's aid from 54 up to 63, but I think morally it was acceptable, it was permissible. What happened in 1963? The South Vietnamese military overthrew the democratically elected government. And from that point on, our war, the American war in Vietnam, was fighting one corrupt tyranny in service of another corrupt tyranny. From that point on, there was no justice or peace at the end of that war. I see no cause, no just cause, animating American involvement after 1963. Compounding it was Johnson's decisions after 65 to Americanize the war and go in with huge main force, send 500,000 troops, and kill a lot of people. And so not only were we fighting, I think, for probably the wrong cause, but the way we went about fighting it from 65 onward was increasingly indefensible. I will then say, I think it became more defensible around 1969 with Creighton Abrams and the pacification campaign, the counterinsurgency campaign. The cause is still, I think, not very defendable because the South Vietnamese government was still not praiseworthy. But at least we were fighting in a more defensible way. Our jus in bello got better near the very end. There's a book called A Better War by Louis Sorley, who makes the case that we basically won or came this close to winning in about 1970-71, and I think that's fairly persuasive because we were fighting in a more defensible way. Even so, I'm not sure there could have been a meaningful, just peace in the aftermath after 63. Yeah. Right there.
What is your opinion on drafting Americans into a war that is not directly self-defense of that country?
Wow. I feel like you have something in mind. So first of all, I think the draft, generally speaking, is a legitimate tool of statecraft. I also think that conscientious objection is a legitimate individual right. By the way, did you know it's not a right under American law, that it's a statutory privilege, and that they could, in theory, repeal that by law? I'm offended by that. I think it should be a right in the Constitution to be an objector. I do. But I think that broadly speaking, the government has the right to ask for our assistance in defense, and I'm fairly comfortable defining defense fairly broadly. So we drafted hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sent them to France to fight World War I. I don't think that was wrong. I don't think that was an unjust use of the government's powers, and World War II, of course, as well. Are you asking about Ukraine?
No. I was asking more about Vietnam.
You're asking about Vietnam, yeah. Yeah, no, well, my previous answer there, I think that after 63, it was no longer a legitimate use of our power. Yeah.
What about Ukraine?
So again, I think Ukraine has the right to defend itself, has the right to seek allies. I think our involvement is very prudent. I think it's good for us to defend the principle of territorial sovereignty and inviolability. I think that what Russia's doing is the most wildly irresponsible, aggressive thing that any great power has done in 80 years. I think it's also a really good idea to not send American troops to Ukraine because with apologies to any Ukrainians present or listening, it's not worth World War III. That would be unjust. Okay, so one just war principle is proportionality. Proportionality. So the stakes, the destruction you visit and risk have to be worth the stakes of what you're fighting for. And Ukrainian independence is a very important cause. It's not worth World War III. We should not risk global nuclear war for the sake of Ukrainian independence. And I'm sorry to say that. Because we should risk global nuclear war for any member of the NATO alliance. That's actually what we've promised. Did you know that we've promised that? If Russia invades the next country over, if they invade Poland, we are committed, already committed, to go to war and fight World War III for Polish independence. And I think we should, because that's what we said, and we stand by our promises. That's what alliances are for. Ukraine's not in the alliance. And so we should not risk or fight World War III for the sake of Ukraine. I see some younger faces in the audience. I was actually alive for the Cold War, and you weren't. I was 7 years old when I learned what nuclear war was, and it terrified me. And I want you to be terrified of that too. I want you to have a holy fear of nuclear war. I was really bothered the day after the Ukraine invasion when some of my students, who were pacifists the day before, were suddenly calling for the bombs to drop on Moscow. No. Prudence is a virtue in statecraft. Let's be careful before we do things that are militarily unnecessary until they become necessary. I pray it never becomes necessary. But essentially, let's let Putin force that on us. And if he does, well, then game on.
There's a lot of discussion, especially online, regarding Christian nationalism that centers around ordered loves and a love for our nation above others. How does that weigh in considerations of jus ad bellum? Is our responsibility to uphold independence and the independence or sovereignty of other nations equal to our love for our own nation, our desire to preserve the lives of our own citizens? How do we weigh those two?
I think patriotism is a virtue. I'm a patriot. I hope you're all patriots. I think patriotism is a virtue for all citizens of every country. And we should all love our countries and seek their betterment. I think all human lives are morally equal. And so I wouldn't want to say that an American life is worth more than a French life or a Ukrainian life. That's not true. But I think that the American government does have a specific responsibility for American lives. I think that's true. And so if you're making a decision of state, yes, you are allowed, in fact, you're obligated to look for yourself first. But let me tack back again and say, often the best way to do that is to ensure that the broader international environment is peaceful and friendly. In other words, if you want to put America first, to use the phrase, if you are a champion for America first, you should be an ardent champion of globalism, of the liberal international order, because the best way to put America's interests first is to invest in the free world so that America isn't threatened in the first place. We live in a community of nations. I know that for generations now we've heard talk about America, the indispensable nation, the hyperpower, the most strongest, greatest power ever in the history of the world. I get it. But we live in a community of nations. We aren't invincible, we're not omnipotent, and we're not God. And we're not Israel. We're not a new Israel. And so the best way to look out for our interests is to foster a friendly international environment with other like-minded nations. The free world is the outer perimeter of American security. The free world is an engine of American prosperity. The free world is a tool of American influence. If you want to put America first, invest in the free world. Time for one more question.
Up to this point, just war theory has included humans versus humans. Do you think in the future we might have to come up with a just war theory that involves machines?
We're out of time. I do actually have a section in this book and in the next one on AI and robots and warfare. The trick here is that it cuts both ways. On the one hand, as you use more robots and machines and AI to wage war, that takes humans off the firing line. And maybe we're less at risk and you're killing fewer people. Also, Augustine said the true evil in war is what happens in your heart. The revengeful lust, the cruelty, the hatred. And if the robots are doing the fighting, we are safe from those sins. We won't be tempted to hatred in our hearts. So those are some good things about the potential of robots in warfare. Here's the dangerous part. When you make something easier, you tend to do more of it, right? It's sort of economics, like supply and demand. When something's cheaper, there's going to be more of it. I did not like how easily our presidents reached for the drone in Iraq, Afghanistan, the war on terror. It became super easy just to push that button. Another drone bomb, another drone bomb, another drone bomb, instead of doing the hard, messy work of investing in peace and justice in South Asia, right? That's hard. Drone bomb, super easy. Just going to keep on doing this. And what do you think that did to the people of Western Pakistan, the people of Afghanistan, the people of Syria and Iraq and everywhere else that we drone bombed. Take that and multiply it by 100-fold when you have robot warriors governed by AI. It's so easy for a president to push a few buttons and send the robot troops off to take care of some problem, when you should have made a phone call or announced an aid package or something. So I'm a little worried about that dynamic. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed our conversation today.